Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host, minister, and friend, Chino Ross, the voice of the Understanding Scripture and Truth by Chino D. Ross YouTube channel. And we're continuing now into part 3 of the Faith Assembly update. I think I've given you so many distractions, Chino. I'm not sure we'll finish in part 3. I'm probably going to throw up all kinds of red herrings for you to follow, but we're going to give it a try and see what happens today.
Hey, that sounds like a good plan, John. I'm sorry. I felt like an idiot afterwards when I looked down at my notes and thought, somehow, somewhere, by some means, either I got distracted or you distracted me from going through the rest of my pictures. So I just thought, well, I'm willing to throw out the offer that I will take from here on out. I will take full responsibility for all of your mistakes.
Well, and you and I had a conversation afterwards. My constant distractions reminded me of the Bugs Bunny cartoon where you've got the big dog that he's set in his ways and he's headed down a path, and the little dog is just dancing around him, yiping, drawing his attention everywhere. That's me and you, Chino, me being the little yappy dog, I think.
Well, we both have a lot of history and a lot to say, a lot of thoughts and a lot on our mind. But from this most recent trip on July the 17th up to northern Indiana to meet with some ex-Faith Assembly ministers, I did a little sightseeing, blast from the past, looked at some old places. So I was in the process of showing some photographs of the new building, which has now become the old building. It's so interesting that that's what they called it, because it didn't really have a name like a cool one, like the Glory Barn. They just said it's the new building. Well, now it is definitely not the new building anymore. It is definitely the old building. And for the thousands of people that have visited that place in the past, and the several thousand that were members, I thought they might find it interesting. So the next picture I wanted to show you was where the baptismal pool was earlier. And now it's just a converted storage room where they keep bits and parts and pieces for this boat repair shop. And then once we got out into the main auditorium, it has been divided up with some full height walls because they did not need that big of just an open space. They needed wall space to put bins and storage places on. But in this next picture, if you look over on the left side, which is kind of framed in, but this is the entranceway where Dr. Freeman would come out of the back room, come on to the platform and come up to the podium. And you can also see there is just a little bit of the red and white sign that had the famous passage, 1 Corinthians 1:10, where Paul said, "Now I beseech you, brethren, that there be no divisions among you." It's interesting that particular place, and I think they just follow in line with all other similar groups, would not want any divisions. They don't want anybody. They don't want me to be doing what I'm doing. I mean, that verse is an attack on me. No divisions, that you'd be perfectly joined together in the same mind, think the same thing, believe the same thing. And, you know, we've talked about that verse before, John. It was a hallmark verse, one of the ones you had to subscribe to if you were going to be a part of Faith Assembly. But Paul's writing that to a church that had all kinds of divisions and separations in it.
Yeah. You know, as many times as I've looked at the splinter groups that emerge from Branham or latter rain, they all seem to go right to that verse and they say, you know, it's wrong to have the divisions. Well, their entire movement exists because they had a division from the main trunk and they splintered off. So the whole thing, it's so ironic, man.
It's all relative. It's just, you know, where are you going to draw the dividing line? I think it's a beautiful verse, and it's definitely the goal in any local assembly that we all be of the same mind, but we've also got to face reality. Everybody comes from different backgrounds. They process the material they're hearing differently. There are stronger and weaker people in a Christian church, and we're clearly told that the stronger need to not flaunt their strength, but help the weaker, and if by no other means, drag them with you into the kingdom. Do what you have to do. But we all are in this together, and we should all be helping each other. Then I think the next photograph I had is really interesting. Dan, who's the owner of the new building turned old building, got a big kick out of the fact that whenever he took possession, someone else, by the way, got the pulpit. I think I know who got the pulpit, or at least part of it. But the whole platform, the raised area upon which the platform, the pulpit was, and the speaker was, and the music guy and team were, that whole raised platform was taken down and taken apart, and Dan turned it into his sewing tables. So he was, he did a lot of upholstery work for the seats in pontoon boats. So you'll see a picture of a big sewing table. And if you look on the ceiling above it, you see a couple of speakers, and Dan loved this too. He said, I've gone around and counted them, and I think there are 150 speakers in the ceiling in this building. So this guy did not want you to get away from him. Wherever you went, it didn't matter where you were. You in the restrooms as well, you were going to have a speaker over your head. And he just thought, he got the biggest laugh out of that. He told me that story 3 or 4 times. Did I tell you? There's 150 speakers in the ceiling of this building right here. So this guy was obsessed that everybody not miss a word of what he had to say, because it was the word of God. It was the word of the Lord that he was giving to you.
Which in Branhamism, again, we're back to Branhamism 101. If you go to my grandfather's, well, now it's not my grandfather's, but the Branham Tabernacle, they had it everywhere. And I can remember clearly sitting in that restroom doing my business, and you could hear it right through the speaker in the bathroom. And it's awkward, too, because you get out of there and you see other brethren, we called them brethren, and your first instinct is to shake their hand, and then you're like, no, wait a minute, this is not the right place or atmosphere for me to be doing this. So it's so odd, man.
Well, yeah, we're going to be probably arrested, you and I, John, for just doing something illegal, and that's just having too much fun. We're just having too much fun. Probably a law against having as much fun as I have in my life. I'm very serious about my calling and about Christianity, but you can be serious and then not take yourself too seriously, and hopefully you'll find the right balance there. So there was a restroom picture in there also. Just those are original stalls and sinks and everything that people who ever went there will, I'm sure, remember. All right, so enough of the family photo, the family album here. So we were talking at the end last time, John, about this ministers' meeting of some ex-Faith Assembly ministers and myself, and I had read one of June's newsletters back in the mid-1970s, where at that time they had a count of what they called 37, and it got higher than that, probably 40 or the low 40s, word ministers or word ministries that went out. So these were ministers under Hobart at Faith Assembly, and they would travel to just to different meetings. The next newsletter June sent out was this one from March of 1977, the very next one from the one I read last time. And she said, since our last newsletter, a group from Iowa wrote us asking for us to send them a teacher. Beginning this week, Harry Albright will be flying there every other week to teach them. We have several pilots in our church who count this as a part of their ministry to fly our ministers to various states to speak. So far, the Lord has not led us to establish churches. And I made the comment last time, I found that interesting back then, and I found it a little inconsistent that we are supposed to have a fivefold ministry, but we have a one five-fold ministry of nothing but teachers, all of whom are required to report back to headquarters. We do have a little denominational structure on our hands. There's just no way around it. And I guess all of us, what we were looking for, what I'm still looking for in any ministry, is consistency. Even if you want to be wrong, just be consistently wrong. Then we can trace things easily. It's the inconsistencies where you speak out of both sides of your mouth, where you say one thing and do another. That's where we end up having a lot of problems. That's what causes a lot of confusion in people's lives. At least I think so. Maybe no one ever thought of this back then, but I wondered, how is it we have a fivefold ministry, but we only have one? We only have these teachers going out, and they're going out. I don't even have a full count of how many satellite groups there were. And we can define that term satellite, more broadly or more tightly. But these were definitely satellite groups where a minister was leaving Faith Assembly, going to a little home group, a home setting, teaching them, and then traveling back. And let's face it, he's just carrying Hobart Freeman doctrine. He really is. Hobart was you're going to have to go somewhere else.
To the audience who's listening without the video feed, there's a cat that just jumped in front of the camera, so we're dodging cats at this point.
Okay, she's down now.
I'm curious about, there's a phrase you mentioned. You mentioned word ministers, and this again is a term that I grew up with constantly in Branhamism. When you leave the cults and you go into a normal church, this isn't a phrase that you hear ever. It's just not said because it is a cult thing, and a lot of people who are in the cult or who have escaped, they really don't realize that. In Branhamism, a lot of people also do not realize this. Branham taught the, quote, spoken word, which, Kenneth Hagin got a lot of mileage out of it, rebranding that to be what he called Rhema, and he started the Rhema Bible Training Center, all of this stuff, and he's credited as the father of it, but, I can trace it back to Branhamism long before Kenneth Hagin would have ever even conceived such a notion. And where it gets interesting is there were men in the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship International who were in William Branham's deity cult. They believe, like T.L. Osborne at William Branham's memorial service, he said that William Branham was God in the flesh. And he says, now, I don't care if you feel me sacrilegious for saying this, but William Branham is God in the flesh. So there was a group of men, of which were key figures in the Word of Faith movement, that were in the deity cult. And I'm curious about that phrase, word ministers. Were they using that in the Word of Faith way? In Branhamism, these would be ministers who were now speaking new spoken word.
That's a good question. I don't know. The way I always interpreted that was they had a teaching ministry. Like one of the guys' name of his ministry was Sound Teaching Ministries. I always took it as a teacher who had a teaching ministry, and they were traveling out to the different satellite groups because these groups were far enough away. Some people chose to move to Indiana. A large number did, but I'm sure the majority chose not to. Hobart used the term all the time. He is in word ministry, and there was a big scramble. There was a big scramble for that. Here's a story hot off the press from the ministers' meeting that I just remembered. One of the ministers there, and like I said, I'm going to keep all their names anonymous for now, and they didn't ask me to, but for now we'll do it. Maybe it's best for everyone. I don't know. But one of the stories they told me that I would not have any way of having known had not a minister, an ex-minister under Hobart tell me this, but he said they had like a trial preaching night one time. It was in front of the church, but every minister was going to get 15 minutes and see how they did. And, so Hobart is, it's like America's Got Talent. You got a judge. Hobart's the judge here, the lone judge, and each minister, give me your best shot for 15 minutes. That'd be pretty hard to do. 15 minutes knowing your mentor is sitting out there, grading you on how you're doing. And this guy said that Hobart told him he did pretty well. And I'm sure he did. And I think there's, in that group of ministers, some of them were definitely better than others. I think the majority of them weren't very good at all. But my point in our study last time was that, what they objected to was that statement I made where the ministers under Hobart couldn't fight their way out of a wet theological bag. One time in our meeting when I was up there 2 weeks ago, I left out the word wet. I said theological bag, and one of the guys corrected me, and he said, "You said wet. You said wet theological bag." And I did, and I love those brothers. I hope they're not throwing things at the screen as they hear me right now. I mean, they were wonderful. They were kind and generous to me. Got a little testy at a point or two, but it's supposed to get a little testy with a group of grown men who think they know it all. It's supposed to get a little testy. That's what makes it fun. But hey, an update before I go any more for anybody who knew Harry Albright. Harry Albright passed away a couple of years ago, October of 2022, at age 75. I didn't know Harry personally. I just knew he was a minister that was going out to Clinton. I think it was Clinton, Iowa, somewhere in Iowa. He was going out to a regular meeting. And another update for Faith Assembly people, and my condolences to Harry's family and friends and everyone that knew him and loved him, was there were a couple of brothers who were ministers. Jim and Joe Branham were two of the well-known ministers at Faith Assembly back in the day. And I think it's been only 2 weeks ago, after I came back from the meeting in northern Indiana, which was on July the 17th, Joe Branham passed away. And his brother Jim, I think the next morning, sent me a text and shared with me the obituary, and some people from other states had already told me that as well. So my condolences and love and sympathy to Joe's family and his children and all the people that loved him. None of us are getting any younger, and apart from Jesus returning during our lifetime, which we all hope for, but apart from that happening, we're all aging and eventually going to die. So, I was thinking after our last conversation, John, about, I know I struck a nerve when I said what I did. I did not mean to offend anyone, hurt anybody's theological or biblical sensitivity to say at that time, I don't think they could fight their way out of a wet theological bag. But as we were concluding last time, my point was, and I still feel that way as I look back on that time period 40 years ago. And what I said was, had they known what they should have known, they should have objected. And if they did know back then something was wrong, then you have to say, shame on you. You should have objected. If you didn't know, you don't know. If you do know, you need to say something about it. And I remember one of the things that I know Dr. Freeman was most upset with me over was he had taught, we're going to have to go back in our mind to like the mid 1970s. There was a movement called the shepherdship movement. It was called shepherdship. It was called neo-discipleship. It also went by the title a covering movement that was led by a group of men, Don Basham, Charles Simpson, Ern Baxter, and I think he came out of Latter Rain and maybe even had connections with William Branham, Derek Prince. There were a group of men that were teaching this philosophy that you Christians can't just be out there on your own in life. You can't just be interpreting scripture on your own. You need to be under a covering of a higher authority, and they're the ones that, set you straight and tell you right doctrine. And as I watched Faith Assembly develop, I thought, I'm seeing the exact same thing. And Dr. Freeman had a series of tapes, 3 of them, and then a 4th one, which was an update. And you had to buy all 4 to get any of them. And it was a scathing, and correctly so, denunciation of the shepherdship movement. And then I saw, aren't we dealing with the same thing if we have a final authority figure and you're not allowed to disagree with him? And if you disagree anything seriously, you're going to be put out. He was not open to being challenged. He was not open for discussion for the most part about anything. I thought we probably have shepherdship on our hands. And so me being me, but again, I was in my mid-20s, I questioned Dr. Freeman about it. I said, I don't see a lot of difference between the way Faith Assembly is now being constructed and the shepherdship movement. And of course, the only response I could get is what you would suspect. Well, we're not like them because everything I'm saying is correct. I'm not leading anybody astray. Well, that's, how convenient is that? And I just thought that's not right and that's not going to work. And let me just give you one example from the ministers' meeting, and I won't say who said it, but here's a prime example. One of the things that Hobart began teaching, or he taught in a message in October, 2 months before he died, and maybe we can discuss this in a later podcast, he outlawed hunting. He knew he had a lot of men in his church that were hunters, and he said, I believe, this is what God has shown me, that we overcomers, everything was about the man-child, the special elite Gideon's army group, overcomers, we overcomers are not going to want to cause any pain or hurt to God's creation. So, Hobart really outlawed hunting. And one of the ministers in the group that I met with told me that, or I might have brought it up because that was a big problem in my mind. That's a totally unbiblical teaching, and it's totally wrong for a minister to use the platform of the pulpit and try to get people to do things you want or stop doing things that you don't want them to do. And he said, when I heard that, even though I was a hunter and even though I didn't really see how that could be biblical or scriptural, because he was my pastor, I decided to put away my weapons and just submit to what my pastor said. And, look, John, part of me appreciates a kind spirit of someone willing to, I'll lay down because part of me appreciates, a kind spirit, but there's another part of me that says that's the very thing you can't do. What I have learned in life, what people who are survivors of cults have learned is that cult leaders are bullies. And the only way you can deal with a bully is you hit them square in the mouth. I don't mean physically, metaphorically, you hit them square in the mouth. But hey, speaking of physically, we all know, John, I remember back in my school days, when I was a kid growing up, I was in this idyllic neighborhood, walked to my little school. It was just like Mayberry RFD. It was perfect. When the Supreme Court decided to institute this busing stuff, then my whole neighborhood got turned upside down, and my little pristine middle school, elementary school and middle school, it became a war zone. And I found out in a hurry as a young kid, they're bullies. I was just like a normal kind of passive kid, but not everybody's like that. They're bullies. And I found out, though, in a hurry, that the only way to get the bully's respect and to get him off your back, literally, you got to fight. And I remember one time people having to come and break up one of my fights because I wasn't going to be bullied by these bullies. And bullies, basically, they're cowards anyway. They rule by fear and intimidation. And I found if you hit them in the mouth, if you hit them hard enough, they don't bully you anymore. That was back in my school days. I don't go around hitting people in the mouth now. But my point is, and this is true, John, you can't let these cult leaders just slide under the radar, their little pet ideas and pet peeves and get everybody to, buy into that, somebody has got to say, we've got to stop the madness. We've got to stop the madness here.
Exactly. I had a similar experience when I was in grade school, and I had to be pried off. And it's a story I won't get into, but it's the one and only fight I got in my life, and I'll say I won it pretty good. But there's some complexity to it for me. In fact, just last night, I finished the last page of the manuscript for the book I'm working on Christian identity. And I have a chapter devoted to the shepherding movement. And what happened is so very strange. And in today's world, you wouldn't really even consider this. But towards the end of William Branham's life in the Latter Rain movement, the deity cult was emerging. Like I said, T.L. Osborne he worshipped William Branham as God in the flesh. He openly did. And it's very difficult because this was a secretive group. You don't know how many others in the Full Gospel Businessmen were doing the same. They all had, I'll say it like this, they all worshiped him whether they knew it or not because they gave him such undue reverence. And none of them critically examined what he said. And then below this series of apostles and prophets that they had created were all the subordinates. And people were actually trained and manipulated, some of them from birth, to fear prophets and not be able to critically think or critically speak out. In other words, they knew, even if they knew they were a bully, they were trained not to come up against the bullies. Well, the history gets really weird because Ern Baxter was one of Branham's closest campaign members. In fact, in the early years, it was called the Baxter-Branham campaigns. They toured together. He, Baxter, F.F. Bosworth was touring with them. Plus, you had all the white supremacy guys and all the Christian identity guys that were in it. Gordon Lindsay was a speaker at Christian identity conferences back whenever it was highly anti-Semitic. I've got newspaper articles of this. Well, when William Branham died, after having trained all of the people that they had to submit to the authority of these apostles, prophets, the fivefold ministry, basically, they held the memorial service wherein they worshiped William Branham as God, and then T.L. Osborne was supplying training materials to Eldon Purvis, who was writing the New Wine magazine. Eldon Purvis was one of the most notorious religious Christian identity figures in the nation at the time. So Christian identity is forming in the shepherding movement. They're coming with leaders who were in Branham's campaigns, and they're being supplied by one who's in Branham's deity cult. I mean, that's how weird this gets. So what they saw was an opportunity to take over and hijack the minds that were already programmed in Branhamism. They saw it as an opportunity awaiting because Branham's dead. Let's go after him. So they created a movement to catch all the fallout. And what that did, based off of what I can tell, is it just created this fertile ground where apostles and prophets could be worshipped. Now in the manuscript, I go further because you mentioned the man-child, which is the manifest sons of God. That was the Joel's Army theme that emerged in early years of Latter Rain. Well, some of those same Christian identity cult members, in fact, one of Branham's proteges, Paul Cain, resurrected the Joel's Army theme for International House of Prayer and brought it all again, and then elevated the apostles and prophets of the NAR to become the shepherds and recreated the shepherding movement.
Yeah, you're totally onto something, John. You mentioned the New Wine magazine. I subscribed to that when I was a teenager. I always was reading New Wine magazine. That was the magazine. Jamie Buckingham had a lot to do with the magazine. I knew who Jamie Buckingham was, but that was a shepherdship magazine right there. I think you're onto something, and it seems like we're beating a dead horse to death again over the fact that these ministers, there's just a pattern here that you don't find when you leave this and go to a normal church. You have a normal pastor and a normal teacher. They just don't try to lord it over you as these men do. And I think it was incumbent upon the young ministers, the 37 word ministers under Dr. Freeman, it was incumbent upon them to challenge him and they didn't. So either they didn't know that he was wrong, or they knew and they were too afraid to say anything. And you and I had talked that I'm willing to give everybody a pass. We've all in our past, made mistakes, said things we wish we wouldn't have said. When you get high up to the actual leader, I think they get less of a pass, not because they themselves have not been duped by someone before, but because they're just negatively affecting so many people's lives. I'm just a small time operator on the outside. I haven't had the influence that some of these other people have had. And maybe that's been a good thing for me. I've been able to look at things a little more objectively and a little more critically. But whenever I did and I brought something up, I was always just shot down by Hobart, and the other ministers there just knew, don't anybody have anything to do with Chino. But somehow, I was actually teaching messages. People can go on my YouTube page and see messages with Hobart Freeman's name in the title, because I had taught some of his stuff to my people, and I wanted to undo that. And I wanted it to be clear and unmistakable. We're not going to dance around the issues and topics and personalities here. We need to be unambiguous. We need to be transparent. We need to be clear. We don't have to be mean-spirited. We can do it in a spirit of love. But one of the kindest things, John, that God ever does for any of us is to correct us. That's one of the kindest things that he ever does. He doesn't have to do that. He could just annihilate us, like these prophets and apostles want to just annihilate us if we disagree with them over something. Well, how many times in God's eyes have we been wrong? And the kindest, most loving thing he can do for us is to correct us, like whatever means or method. Sometimes your correction comes from your friends, and sometimes it comes from your enemies. But by whatever method or avenue, just that God would correct us is a very loving thing. I would ask simple questions to Dr. Freeman, like on faith. I thought Dr. Freeman had a terribly unbiblical view of faith. And I'll just walk people, they say, oh, no, he was a faith teacher. He knew everything about faith. No, he didn't. And I'll walk you down a real simple, logical path. So what Hobart would say is no one ever dies believing. You only die doubting. And if you pray the prayer of faith, you always get the answer. And then he'd have people who are struggling. And so they pray and something doesn't go the way they had asked the Lord for it to go. Hobart would say, didn't have enough faith. They didn't pray in faith. They didn't have faith. And then on another tape, he'd be dealing with someone who's struggling with whether or not they have enough faith, and he'd quote him Romans 12:3. God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. You have faith. And what's the measure? Well, the smallest faith you could possibly have is probably a mustard seed, and that'll move a mountain or wither a fig tree. So if you've got the faith of a grain of mustard seed, you have all that you can possibly have. And then, the reason it didn't work is you didn't have faith, or you didn't have enough faith. He knew verses very well. He did not have a biblical theology of faith. He did not have a biblical theology of divine healing. Is divine healing in the Bible? It 100% is, from cover to cover. Old Testament and New Testament, people are healed. Hobart had a doctrine of divine healing. He had a doctrine that said, based on Isaiah 53, the suffering servant passage, that healing is in the atonement. That if our sins are covered by Christ's atonement, so are our sicknesses and our illnesses. They are covered in the same atonement. They're covered the same way, and they are available by the same means, and that is by asking God. But what I said is, wait a minute, there is a huge difference. I'm not denying that healing is in some way in the atonement. I'm not denying that at all. But I said, wait a minute, there is a huge difference between sin, which is in the atonement, and sickness. one of those things we commit, one of those things we catch. They are not the same thing. We commit a sin. Sometimes you just get ill. You catch an illness. You catch a cold. You didn't do anything to deserve that or to earn that. It's just something that you caught. So I said that right there tells me we need to do a deeper study of what does Isaiah 53 mean. And speaking of Isaiah 53, Matthew quotes it in Matthew 8:16 and 17 as applying during Jesus' earthly ministry. Matthew said in verse 16 of Matthew 8, when even was come, they brought unto him many that were possessed with demons and that were sick. He cast out the spirits. With a word, he healed all that were sick, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet. And he's quoting Isaiah 53. And this is long before Calvary. This is before the atonement. And somehow something is being fulfilled at that time. And this isn't a theological podcast, John, so we won't delve into that. But my point, I hope, is well taken. It was not a well thought out theology of faith, and it was not a well thought out theology of healing. There were proof texts, but a proof text without a context is a pretext for nonsense, is what I've always taught my students. There is a local context for that proof text, and there is a broader context, which is the whole of Scripture. And Scripture is not going to contradict Scripture, and Scripture has to be used to interpret Scripture, and that just was not happening with Dr. Freeman's teaching.
Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support. You know, I laughed, and I shouldn't have. It was wrong of me, but when you mentioned that the gentlemen were upset because of the wet paper bag, wet theological bag thing, you know, the part of the reason I laughed is because in the Branhamism, it's entirely different. It would be a compliment to have said that to a Branhamite pastor because they have no theological bag. They literally just quote Branham over and over like broken records. And those same ministers, if they were to sit in a Branham sermon, they'd stand up and say, "What are you guys doing, man? You're quoting this dead guy from the 60s who had he even admitted he didn't know what was in the Bible. He said, I don't know the book real well, but I know the author, and yet I'm going to teach you everything about it." So, you know, it's ironic, but I think if those same men were to just you can go yourself, table.branham.org. It's the cult headquarters website. It's got all the Branham sermons that they allow you to see. You'll notice the very first sentence says, we're getting some new gadgets for recording, which means they've erased all of the sermons of the old gadgets. But in any case, you can search them. Every single phrase that you've mentioned to this point in this episode of the podcast, you can find it in Branham. It's Branhamism 101, right down to the atonement, the by his stripes we're healed. That actually came from John Alexander Dowie, not Branham. But F.F. Bosworth, who toured in Branham's campaigns and was Branham's mentor, was a leader in Dowie's cult in Zion, Illinois. And Bosworth trained Branham to believe that phrase meant that whenever Christ died, he died for your healing too, and healing and salvation come in the same package. It's a very twisted form of the dual atonement that they teach. So I'm not getting to theology either. This is really just blatant history, and you can look it up on the internet. But they taught this version of divine healing that was completely false, and anyone who rose up against them were seen as the enemy by this movement. And the real problem is and I guess this does border into theology, because of the way British Israelism morphed into Christian identity and impacted the latter rain movement. What they did was, because they had this false notion that Americas of the 1900s were the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel, lost 10 tribes of Israel, and certain specific passages from the Old Testament applied to us today. When you do that, you have to totally eliminate the notion of a new covenant. So all through my 36 years of Branhamism, they might mention new covenant, but they really didn't understand what it meant.
Well, I believe what you're saying, John. I do definitely believe in a message of faith and healing. I do believe that's taught in the New Testament, but I just don't think Hobart ever, he never developed it the way it should have been developed theologically for it to be consistent. He talked about healing in the atonement, but then people weren't allowed to wear eyeglasses. Well, unless that's macular degeneration, some kind of eye disease, that's not a disease, or that's not a sickness, and then it went further. Then broken bones, you're not allowed to go to a doctor and have a cast or anything set. And then everything just continued to progress. And they didn't even go to dentists, let alone go to a dentist to fix a tooth. They wouldn't go to dentists to get their teeth cleaned. I'll never forget one of the last times I got to hang out with June, with Mrs. Freeman. I hadn't seen her in a while. And she was a sweet lady, but bless her heart, when she opened her mouth, her teeth were green. And I was just shocked. And I felt so sorry, because even if, let's just grant your healing in the atonement, your sickness and illness, let's just grant that for a moment. That didn't have anything to do with eyewear and glasses and dentist and teeth cleaning. That's what I mean by the lack of theological clarity and precision in the area of faith and healing. If you're going to teach on that, and you should, the New Testament is full of teaching on faith and healing. If you're going to do that, you need to be responsible, and you need to have clarity and precision. Because when you don't, and you just run to these verses, by his stripes we're healed, if you just run to the verses and you quote the verses, then what happens is, because you haven't filled in background information, because you have not put the flesh on the bones, people just have to start figuring out in their own mind, and they're watching what others are doing. Wow, okay, all of my healing is covered in the atonement. And then it became real minute. Okay, well, what actually is a sickness or an illness? What is that? What is just normal? And so you're confused. What's covered in the atonement and what is it? And it's just easier to say, well, anything medical. Whenever Hobart at the end brought in how evil the MDs, the medical deities, were, that they all have a background in sorcery and witchcraft, then for sure you don't want to have anything to do with them. So you've got these people dying. You have these people not driving. You have husbands whose wives could see and they couldn't, so they have to surrender their driver's license, and their wives or friends drive them to and from work, and their wives drive the family to and from church all the time. I mean, John, it was just a mess. So I was critical of Dr. Freeman's doctrine of divine healing and his doctrine of faith, even though he thought he was the only man who had been given the pure, uncompromising faith message for the end times. He could not fight his way out of a wet theological bag. If you sat down with a group of trained biblical people and you raised biblically valid questions on faith and healing, with where Hobart ended up on his view, he couldn't have gotten himself out of a bag either. And let's don't anyone forget the man who taught all of this. God love him and bless his heart, but the man that taught all of this died of everything he said that he would not die from.
the way in which this was presented in this movement was so twisted. There were a lot of people who were opposed to the divine healers, and they would quote it, divine healers as such. If you read through the newspapers, it got so tremendous that if you do a search for William Branham, you're going to find his halo photograph, with the lighting above his head, which it's fully debunked. If you go to my website, these guys in the Full Gospel Businessman, Voice of Healing, they claimed that it was the only supernatural light ever taken, and they don't mention that basketball players and the Beatles had the same exact halo over their heads in the photos, because that was the lighting in the Sam Houston Coliseum. But that photo exists because of a debate between a Baptist minister, F.F. Bosworth, and William Branham, wherein the Baptist minister said, I truly believe that God heals. The Bible clearly says that God heals. But there's nowhere in the Bible that says that I have to have a human being that is my intercessor between God and my healing. There's nothing that even remotely suggests this. And so they held this big debate, and ironically, Branham tells this story, and I think it may even be published in the one of the magazines. I can't remember which, but they say it's the only roll of film that developed. God would not allow the photographs to be taken of any of the debate except for my halo photo, basically. Well, I found in the newspapers back then, they had a whole slew of photographs, and the two men fighting, I started reading through the article, it actually broke out in a fist fight. the men on the divine healing side, they got so frustrated. I guess they got tied in a theological knot because they too couldn't fight their way out of a wet theological bag. And so they decided, okay, we're just going to take up fists and we're going to fight our way out of it. And they had to, the man's name was Reverend Best. They had to get him out of the building before they attacked him. It was that bad. And that's how this movement trains you. It trains you to be so polarized against somebody who doesn't think and see things the way that you do, that you want to fight them. And it's just totally wrong. This is not Christianity at all.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things there, John. I didn't want to fight Dr. Freeman or any of the other ministers. I just wanted a discussion. So let's sit down and debate and dialogue. And the William Branham halo, I just love the William Branham halo because I was 18 years old. I was a freshman at the University of Mississippi, and I've told you a little bit of this story before. But I had enough time to not only do my school studies, but I was just buying everything I could buy from all of the healing revivalists. And right at that time, a professor at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, Dr. David Edwin Harrell, had come out with this book entitled All Things Are Possible. And it was going to be the factual history of the whole healing revival. And one of the pictures on the front cover was that halo over William Branham. And did I believe that was real? Absolutely. I believe that was real. And then you open it and you get the pictures inside the book. And I just thought, wow. Well, I came later not to believe that, not because I had any evidence, which you have provided us with. I just knew William Branham's a false prophet. So I don't believe anything about him. Well, what do you do with the halo? I don't care about halos. None of that means anything to me. I was able to reject all that stuff without historical proof. And then I see what you have been able to show people are pictures in that same Coliseum of the same halo over other people. And when I saw that, I go, well, I knew there had to be an explanation. I didn't know what it was. It's either a demon manifesting. It's not God. It's either a demon or there's some normal explanation. And thankfully, you were able to give me that. But Hobart criticized me from the pulpit. I did not want to get into a physical fight, but I did want to get into a theological fight, quote unquote, a discussion. I think iron does sharpen iron. I think we can all help each other. I think we all have blinders on at some part of our theological perception, and you need some help to get out of that. So, yeah, the ministers did not like what I said. I think they probably can fight their way out of a lot of theological bags. Now, some of them, the better ones, can.
Just not a wet one.
Okay, a wet one. Let's make sure we include that. No, some of these guys, and I can't speak for all. I only know the ones that I know. Some of them are very sharp. One of them, especially in biblical languages like Hebrew, man, he could dance circles around me. I'll ride his coattails for stuff like that. But it was hard for me as a 20-something-year-old minister to think that my leader might have led me astray. And that was difficult. That was difficult to process because, we all want to follow someone who's perfect. We don't want to have to think for ourselves. We all want someone that we can say, hey, if he said it, we can take it to the bank. But unfortunately, that's not true. It's not true for any of us who are leaders. And so everyone who's a follower just needs to beware of, we need to be like the Bereans. There's such a thing as being a more noble versus a less noble person. And Paul said in Acts 17:11 that the Bereans were more noble. And he described in what way they were more noble. They received what Paul said, but they didn't stop there. So they went home and they searched the scriptures daily to see if what this apostle, the apostle Paul, he was definitely writing what he said. They didn't take it at face value. They went home and searched the scriptures daily to see if those things were so. So it was difficult for me to make the challenge, but I did it. And then a few years after that, let me just give you one more thing, John. I don't want to keep you on too long, but I told everyone before that Dr. John Davis, who was a student of Dr. Freeman's at Grace Seminary when Hobart was still teaching there on faculty, Dr. John Davis happened to get the exact same degrees as Hobart. He majored in Hebrew and Old Testament, and Dr. Freeman was his mentor. And in late September of 1983, Dr. Davis did a series of 4 articles for the Warsaw Times-Union newspaper. And here is something he said. And when I read this, because I was still a young minister in 1983, when I read this, it said, I think I'm doing okay. I think I'm on the right path. Here's what he said. Anyone contemplating leaving Faith Assembly is warned about various judgments which God would bring upon them. Jack Farrell, one of the associate pastors, put it this way in a recent message. A young man recently left our ministry and just upped and died. A crushing silence settled over the entire congregation. The implications were obvious. But in spite of the threats of doom, a number of former members have indicated that with less and less exposure to Freeman, many would drift away from the assembly to other charismatic congregations. Because most of the ministers, Dr. Davis said, quote unquote, in the assembly, he's talking about the 37-word ministries, have no formal theological education apart from that which they have received here, and are at best a pale imitation of Freeman. Messages by his associate ministers that I have heard at the assembly or on tape, and I've heard more than 40, were shallow, poorly organized, full of biblical references taken out of context, replete with absurd generalizations about other churches or denominations, saturated with veiled threats, and redundant beyond imagination. That's coming from a graduate level teacher, a seminary level professor who definitely not only knows his Bible, but he's professionally trained, he's professionally educated. That was his take, not my take. This is a third party's take. That was his take on the 37-word ministers. And I happen to agree because I had felt the same thing before I ever read what he said. So look, to the ministers from Faith Assembly that I spoke with, I think they are good Christian men. They're in their own ministry, spreading the gospel, teaching people the Bible. We're decades later. I'm sure we all have much sounder theology than we did back then. love to everyone who is going further and deeper with the Lord. But I guess the lesson learned is anytime a minister stands up and tells you something and then says, believe it because I said it, just walk out the door. He does not deserve an audience, because you're not treating your people with the respect they deserve. They are people, they are Christians, they need to come to their own conclusion. Yes, you can help point them down the right path, but do it in a godly, biblical fashion. And you're just responsible for the input. You're not responsible for the output. You've given your input. That's what you're responsible for as a Christian minister. Let these people figure it out on their own. And they either agree with what you taught or they don't. And God bless us all, John, in our pursuit of learning God's Word.
You made a comment earlier that I fully agree with. It doesn't matter if you're wrong, if you're consistently wrong. It shows that you're not trying to fool people. That's really, for me, I have a real problem with ministers who are deceptive. Even today in my journey after we left the cult, I've tried several different churches. I'm not going to lie, I sat in a few which I really felt like the minister was being a little bit deceptive. We walked out of the door, and that was the last time that we went there. It's that bad. Not all churches are like that. And I'm a person who studies on my own. The minister, for me, a pastor is supposed to be someone who is helping you learn. And I take the initiative that I learn on my own. And what I've found is that I can find two respected ministers who everyone looks up to for their theology, who fully disagree on certain passages that, in my opinion, are fundamental passages that are really important. But they see it one way and the other guy sees it the other way. Which you're going to choose? And in the cult, you're taught a very black or white mentality. It's right or it's wrong. And in the real world, it's not like this. Not everybody sees things eye to eye, and that's why you have all of these Christian denominations. Everybody had their points that they saw as the most important, and they chose a denominational path that led them there. So, to the ministers who were maybe offended by that statement, you have to think outside the box just a little bit, because everybody has a difference of opinion. It's just that back then, Hobart is no exception to this rule. There was a lot of deception. The point I'm trying to make is try and be consistent. And like Chino said, don't be deceptive. If you're wrong, admit you're wrong and change your ways. That's really the bottom line for me. But anyway, Chino, this has been fun. I know it's an unusual series of podcasts, but for the people of Faith Assembly, I think it'll really, really help them. So thank you so much for doing this.
I hope so, John. You're welcome.
If you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For an overview of the historical research of William Branham and the healing revivals, read Preacher Behind the White Hoods, a critical examination of William Branham and his message. Available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.